The attorney's hand was already extended before anyone in the room had time to breathe. Dorothea Vane, the 58-year-old family attorney of the Callaway Wentworth estate, stood just behind Lyra with a sealed envelope pressed between two fingers like it was evidence at a crime scene. Beside her, Petra Solis, Lyra's 32-year-old closest friend, and the only person who had driven 3 hours through an ice storm to be there that morning, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. It was the sound of something snapping. The room froze. Lyra Callaway Wentworth, 37 years old, founder and silent majority shareholder of Callaway Capital Group, a private equity firm valued at $420 million, stood at the center of the Callaway family sitting room and looked at her husband of 9 years as he handed her a manila envelope with the same expression someone might use to return a parking ticket. His name was Desmond Fairchild. He was 41. He was Senior Director of Portfolio Acquisitions at Callaway Capital Group. He had been hired there 6 years ago by a search firm that didn't know who had actually approved his file. He did not know that his wife had approved his file. He did not know his wife owned the company. He didn't know a lot of things. The envelope landed in Lyra's hands. She didn't open it. She already knew what it was. Her attorney had called her 40 minutes earlier. While she was still standing in the anteroom of the funeral home, adjusting her black gloves and trying to remember how to put one foot in front of the other, Dorothea had said the words calmly, the way attorneys do when they've learned that calm is its own kind of cruelty. Desmond filed this morning. He wants the divorce finalized before the estate proceedings begin. Lyra had listened. She had not cried. She had thanked Dorothea and hung up and walked back into the sitting room where her parents' caskets were being arranged for the private family viewing. Both of them, her mother and her father. A car accident on Route 9, 2 Tuesdays ago. The kind of thing that didn't make sense, no matter how many times you turned it over. And now her husband was handing her divorce papers in that room, with the flowers still being arranged, with her mother's reading glasses sitting on the side table because someone had found them in her coat pocket and didn't know where else to put them. Desmond did not look uncomfortable. That was the thing Petra would talk about later in the car, in a voice that was very quiet and very certain. He did not look like a man who was ashamed. He looked like a man who had done his calculations and found them satisfactory. Lyra set the envelope on the table next to her mother's glasses. She did not say anything. She turned and walked to the window and looked out at the lawn, where the funeral home staff was carefully arranging the chairs for the outdoor graveside service scheduled for that afternoon. Petra watched her. Dorothea watched her. Two of Lyra's cousins, who had arrived from Ohio an hour earlier and did not yet understand what had just happened, watched her with a low, confused dread. Desmond straightened his tie. His name in the internal company directory at Callaway Capital Group was listed as Desmond Fairchild, Senior Director Portfolio Acquisitions, 3rd floor. He had a parking spot. He had an assistant named Jules who brought him coffee at 9 and again at 2. He had a performance review scheduled for the following month that he had already been told would result in a promotion. He had no idea that the woman who would conduct that review reported directly to Lyra. He had no idea that Lyra had quietly restructured the firm's board 14 months ago, removing 2 of the founding partners who had grown comfortable and consolidating operational authority entirely in her own hands. He had no idea because the restructuring had been handled through a holding company with a different name, and because Desmond had never found his wife particularly interesting at dinner. He found other women interesting at dinner. Her name was Serafina Voss. She was 34, and she worked in the firm's communications department, external relations, brand management, the floor directly above Desmond's. She had a gift for languages and a very particular gift for finding the kind of men who wanted to be seen as more important than they were, and then letting them believe she agreed. Desmond had believed for 11 months. Lyra had known for 7. She had found out the way most people find out, not from a private investigator or a dramatic confrontation, but from a photograph. Her assistant, a 26-year-old named Orla, had forwarded her an image of a restaurant receipt uploaded by mistake to a shared project folder. The receipt was from a place Lyra had never been. The card used was a joint account she hadn't checked in years. The timestamp was a Tuesday evening, when Desmond had told her he was at a client dinner in Arlington. Lyra had stared at the receipt for a long time. Then she had forwarded it to Dorothea and said, "Don't do anything yet." That had been 7 months ago. She was a patient woman. She had learned patience from her father, who had built the first iteration of Callaway Capital from a 2-room office in suburban Maryland with $14,000 and a borrowed fax machine. He had taught her that the difference between a good outcome and a great outcome was often just timing. Knowing when to move, Lyra had waited. She had watched Desmond come home on the evenings he came home and talk about his day in the broad strokes men use, when they've stopped believing their wives are really listening. She had watched him check his phone under the table. She had watched him become slightly better dressed, in a way he didn't think she noticed. She had cooked dinner twice a week because she genuinely liked cooking, and she had listened to him explain things about the industry she had built, and she had said very little. She was very good at saying very little. Callaway Capital had started as a wealth management consultancy. Lyra's father, Gordon Callaway, had pivoted it into private equity in the late 90s, when the market made that possible. When he and Lyra's mother, Ruth, had brought her into the firm at 26, she had been the youngest person on the investment committee by 11 years. By 30, she had restructured the firm's flagship fund and returned 42% in a year when the market was flat. By 34, her parents had transferred operational control entirely to her. The name stayed the same. That was the only thing her father had asked. She had kept it. The firm's public-facing materials listed the founding family, but did not specify which member of the family was currently in charge. This was by design. Lyra moved better in rooms where people didn't know exactly what she was. She had found over the years that the moment people knew who you were, they stopped being themselves around you, and she needed to see who people actually were. She had married Desmond in the spring, 9 years ago, at a small ceremony at her parents' house in Chevy Chase. He had been charming then in the uncomplicated way of men who are very good at first impressions. He worked in finance, which was not where she had found him. She had found him at a friend's birthday weekend in the Outer Banks, playing cards and laughing too loudly, and occasionally saying something that was almost interesting. She had been, in her own private accounting of the situation, lonely. Not desperately, just in the way that someone is lonely when their life has become very large and very full and there is no one in it who is simply theirs. He had seemed like he could be simply hers. He wasn't. The divorce papers stayed on the table next to her mother's glasses all through the private viewing. Lyra stood near the door and greeted the people who came. Her parents' friends, her own former colleagues, a few distant relatives who still remembered her as a child, and looked at her now with something between sorrow and awe. She shook hands. She accepted embraces. She thanked people for driving. Desmond stood on the other side of the room and talked to her cousin Marcus about golf. Petra stayed close to Lyra all morning. She didn't ask questions. She didn't say what Lyra could see she was thinking. She just refilled Lyra's water glass and occasionally put a hand on her shoulder, and Lyra was more grateful for that than she could have said. At 11:40, Desmond's phone buzzed 3 times in rapid succession. Lyra didn't look at it. She had stopped looking at his phone months ago. There was nothing his phone could tell her that she didn't already know. And besides, she had more pressing information. What Desmond did not know, and what Dorothea had confirmed 2 weeks earlier, before the accident, before all of this, was that Lyra had already begun the process of separating her personal assets from anything jointly titled. It was a quiet process, methodical. She had been advised to do it when she first told Dorothea about the photograph, and she had done it in stages, the way her father had taught her to do everything. She hadn't filed anything yet. She hadn't made any decisions. She had simply prepared. And then her parents had died on a Tuesday on Route 9, and the world had reorganized itself into something she barely recognized. And Desmond had apparently decided that the timing was right. The graveside service was at 2 in the afternoon. The January air was cold and very still. The funeral home had arranged 40 chairs in neat rows and covered them with white fabric, and someone had placed white lilies along the edge of the canopy because they were Ruth Callaway's favorites, and Lyra had said so in the arrangements call. Desmond sat in the family row. He sat there because he was still her husband, and she had not told him to sit anywhere else. Serafina Voss, as far as Lyra knew, was not there. She had not been invited. The minister spoke. He talked about Gordon and Ruth the way ministers do when they've had enough time to prepare, with specific details, with warmth, with the particular attention to someone's life that makes it briefly feel intact. Lyra had given him the stories herself the week before. She had told him about her father's fax machine and her mother's garden, and the way they had argued about crossword puzzles at breakfast for 41 years, and how the arguing was the love, and the minister had listened carefully and written it all down. Lyra did not cry during the service. She had cried for 6 days after the accident privately, in the way she did most things. She was done crying by the service. She stood at the edge of the grave when it was time, and she let the soil fall, and she said goodbye in the way you say goodbye when the person can't hear you. But you mean it absolutely. Afterward, at the reception at the house, Desmond poured himself a drink and found a corner and checked his phone. Lyra watched him from across the room. Dorothea came to stand next to her. "Have you looked at the filing?" Dorothea asked. Not yet, you should. There are some things in the asset disclosure that are going to require a conversation. What things? Dorothea's expression was precise. He's listed his position at the firm as a primary asset. He's included his projected compensation for the next 3 years as part of the marital estate he's seeking a share of. Lyra was quiet for a moment. His projected compensation, she said. Yes, at my company. Dorothea said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Lyra set down her glass. She thought about her father, who had sat at a folding table in a 2-room office 30 years ago, and believed that something could be built if you were patient and precise. She thought about her mother, who had kept the books for the first 4 years and never once asked for credit. She thought about the $14,000 and the borrowed fax machine. She thought about Desmond Fairchild explaining her own firm's projected revenue to her across the dinner table 6 months ago, with the particular confidence of someone who had read a summary document and mistaken it for expertise. She asked Dorothea to be at her office Monday morning at 8. The call came on a Thursday 10 days later. It came to Desmond's cell phone at 3 in the afternoon, while he was in a meeting on the 3rd floor. The number belonged to the firm's internal HR department. The voice on the other end belonged to Renata Cole, the head of human resources, a woman Desmond had always found slightly formal but generally accommodating. Renata told him that his position at Callaway Capital Group was being eliminated effective immediately, as part of a strategic restructuring of the portfolio acquisitions division. She told him this was not a performance-based action. She told him he would receive a separation package in accordance with his contract. She did not tell him who had authorized the restructuring. She didn't need to. Desmond called Lyra that night. She did not answer. He called again. He sent a text that said we need to talk, and another that said this isn't right, and a third that she read and did not respond to. He called Dorothea's office the next morning. Dorothea's assistant told him that Ms. Vane was unavailable and that any communication regarding the divorce proceedings should be directed to her associate. What Desmond had not understood, what he had spent 9 years and $420 million failing to understand, was that Lyra had not been careless. She had never been careless. She had built something careful and serious and lasting, and she had married him in good faith, and she had given him time and meals and the particular patience of someone who still believed, for a long time, that people could become more than their first impressions. He had not become more. He had become a liability, and Lyra Callaway Wentworth had not built $420 million worth of anything by holding on to liabilities. The divorce was finalized in March, in a proceeding that was notable for how brief it was. Dorothea had counted every item in Desmond's original filing. The projected compensation claim was removed in the first round of negotiations, when Lyra's legal team submitted a 1-page document establishing her as the controlling shareholder and sole executive authority of Callaway Capital Group. The document included her original ownership stake, the transfer of authority from her parents, and the board restructuring from 14 months prior. Desmond's attorney had looked at the document for a long time before speaking. The settlement was not what Desmond had anticipated. Serafina Voss resigned from the firm in February, before the divorce was finalized. She submitted her notice via email on a Monday and was escorted from the building by HR at noon. The notice did not give a reason. It didn't need to. Petra drove Lyra home after the final hearing. They didn't talk much. The radio was on, something low and ambient, and the city moved past the windows in the flat light of March. "Are you okay?" Petra asked, at a red light. Lyra thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a month." Petra nodded. That was the right answer, and she knew it. At home, Lyra changed out of her court clothes and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. There was work to do. There was always work to do, but she sat for a moment without opening anything. The house was quiet. Outside, the tree in the backyard that her mother had planted 15 years ago was starting to show the first small evidence of spring, tiny and insistent, and not yet quite visible unless you were looking for it. Lyra was looking for it. She had a board meeting in 2 weeks and a fund review the week after that, and a conversation with her general counsel about the restructuring they'd been deferring since November. She had a firm to run. She had her parents' estate to finalize and their house in Chevy Chase to decide about, and her mother's reading glasses still sitting in a drawer at home because she hadn't figured out what to do with them. She had all of that. But first she sat with the coffee and the quiet for a little while, because she had learned from her father, from the fax machine, from $14,000 in 30 years, that you couldn't build anything lasting if you didn't first stop and account for where you actually were. She was 37 years old. She owned something her father had started and her mother had kept, and she had grown into something neither of them had been entirely able to imagine, which was the most honest tribute she could pay to either of them. She was starting over. Not from nothing, from something, from the thing she had built when no one was paying close enough attention. She opened her laptop. She had work to do.